The World Health Organization has listed addiction to electronic and video games as a mental health disorder. The controversial decision has left the gaming industry at odds with scientists. Paul Chatterjian reports.
In this virtual universe made up of zeros and ones, dense purple storm clouds shroud the planet. 98% of the world's population has disappeared, and zombies rise to attack remaining humans.
It's very fast-paced, and it keeps you engaged the whole time. It's just a lot of fun.
So much fun that the mass online phenomena called Fortnite is consuming hundreds of millions of players around the world. While the goal of the game is to battle for the survival of humanity, some people's fragile psyche may not survive these all-consuming digital games.
We have been reviewing the evidence for the gaming behavior as a disorder for last several years.
The World Health Organization's decision to label addiction to digital and video games as a mental health disorder puts it at odds with gaming industry organizations. Its reference guide of recognized and diagnosable diseases describes the addiction as a pattern of persistent or recurrent gaming behavior that becomes so extensive it takes precedence over other life interests.
The person loses control over the gaming and ignores other essential activities like sleep, like eating, like taking part in education or work, and that harms the person. And in spite of the harm, the person continues with gaming.
Parents have been concerned about the endless hours their children have spent in front of their consoles since the advent of Atari and Pong. Now they have science as their weapon to limit the time their children spend gaming. The WHO says only a small number of people who play digital and video games would develop a mental health disorder, but early warning signs can help prevent it. And while the makers of Fortnite are expected to earn more than $4 billion this year, addiction to gaming is creating niche gaming addiction treatment programs, which may even be more lucrative for insurance companies and healthcare providers now that gaming addiction is considered a mental health disorder.
Why do smartphones, social media and computer games keep us hooked? Well, they're designed to. The tech industry uses human psychology and calls it behaviour design or persuasive tech. Companies don't conceal this. Apple readily admits its products are addictive. It's even designing an app to help you use your phone less. The average person checks their phone 150 times a day. Psychologists, though, are beginning to describe the deliberate engineering of addiction as an unethical practice. And some within the tech industry want higher standards too. But in the meantime, for a tech company in the attention economy, the more time a user spends online equals more money from ad revenue. And that revenue hit a record $88 billion in 2017. Well, joining me now from London is Dr. Jamie Woodcock. Jamie is a researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute. Good to have you with us. So first of all, how is human psychology used in digital design?
Well, I think what we've seen is many attempts to introduce ways, as you mentioned, to capture people's attention. And I think it's no surprise, really, that these kind of psychological aspects are being included. But I think one of the ones we have to point to as being particularly problematic is the use of gambling or gambling-like aspects in video games, for example, to get users not only hooked, but also can cost them a lot of money too.
Give us some examples of how popular apps and social media platforms use psychology then, other than the gambling games you've referred to.
I mean, I think many of these are around feedback loops that are introduced into these platforms. These build on well-known effects about, dopamine loops and so on, that you get a rush with a particular kind of interaction. And I think many software platforms, but many games as well, try to mobilize this to keep users on the platform. And ultimately, this becomes not so that you share information or you communicate or you get time to play, but to keep people hooked on a platform to make money from it.
Well, you're in a university. Are students and people being taught how to use human psychology and some of these techniques that you're talking about?
So I'm a sociologist by training. So I think one of the things that we try to teach students is a critical approach to these kinds of forms of media, that perhaps we can look beyond these kind of psychological aspects.
Well, I understand in your department, I wasn't trying to blame you personally, but I mean, generally in institutions, educational institutions and universities, is that where it starts, that people are taught these techniques?
I mean, I think so, and I think one of the aspects here that we really need to talk about is gamification, and this is where psychological understandings of these feedback loops are being introduced into more and more aspects of our lives. So it's no longer just on social media or just when you're playing video games, but these are used at work, or they're used to keep you exercising. And I think we need to ask questions about, is it right that these things are used to convince us to do things?
Is it ethical?
So I think this is the big question right now, isn't it? How ethical is it? And I think, in a way, many of these kinds of platforms and kinds of games can be incredibly persuasive. But in a sense, for a company making these products, of course they're going to do this. There's been a long history of trying to make buying products from a company persuasive. I think what we have to do is have conversations about, how manipulative these things can be, and particularly when it involves money. And I think part of this, as an academic, is teaching people to think critically about the way they use these kind of platforms.
Well, other than teaching people how to think critically, I mean, now that the WHO is talking about mental health issues, should there be regulation?
Yeah. So I mean, I think there already is regulation of various kinds, particularly
well, does there need to be
video
more?
Games.
And perhaps in a different way or different level now?
In many ways. Yeah, I think in many ways this is it's a new story, but it's also an old story. So when we have new forms of media that are being used by children that perhaps their parents don't understand or didn't use themselves, we often get these kind of moral panics. Today it's Fortnite. In previous years it was staying up watching TV all night, or watching online videos, or reading books with trashy content or whatever it is. And I think one of the biggest things we could do to move this debate forward is rethink the relationship that technology plays between families. So if parents are worried about Fortnite, perhaps they should play it with their children to get an experience of it, because it's not that the media itself is inherently problematic, it's that there are problematic uses of it.
So this should be a sort of family level regulation. You don't see a role for the industry itself, I don't know, psychologists getting involved in sort of the programming design stage and that sort of thing?
I mean, I think there's one aspect that does need regulation, and that's the use of gambling in video games. Mm-hmm. So the use of loot boxes or other techniques that are involving gambling being targeted at people who are underage, who might not understand the risks of gambling. But that's something where we have the regulation for this. It's just a matter of the regulation being applied properly.
All right, we're talking about some of these terms like loot boxes and feedback loops. I mean, what sort of negative side effects are they producing in human behavior? Let's explain them and demystify some of these terms a little bit.
So I think, with feedback loops, this is something that's not necessarily a problem. This is something where somebody gains some kind of enjoyment and they're able to go through that process. So it's going on Twitter and finding that your tweet has been liked and retweeted a whole number of times, or it's winning in a video game. So these things that's not necessarily problematic. But I think when these things are tied into gambling aspects, so a loot box is essentially a reward in a video game where the contents of it is randomized, and so people don't know what they're going to get when they open it up. And often this can become problematic because people can then buy additional attempts to win what they want. And that is a way of mobilizing that feeling of winning something, of some positive feedback, and tying it into small purchases or keeping people on the game, which is a form of gambling.
What is it doing to people? Is it simply that it's keeping people glued to their phones, or is it doing something deeper to human psychology?
So I think there are arguments that the use of these new kinds of media are changing the way we think or our attention span or so on. But in a way, technology has always had these kinds of effects. It changes how we think and it changes what we do. And what I worry about is that we think that the entire media form is a problem. You know, it's true there are cases where people are becoming addicted to these games and so on, but the vast majority of the use is not like that. So I think we have to be careful in kind of, you know, over kind of generalizing the use of these forms of media.
And the final one about, you know, the shift towards artificial intelligence is something that, you know, we're all talking about. And I'm wondering whether technology will be even more able to manipulate human psychology in the future because of artificial intelligence. For a profit, of course.
So I think this is a really interesting question. You know, at present, you know, artificial intelligence has been used in a whole number of new domains, you know, looking over legal documents in medical uses and so on. Psychology remains quite a difficult thing to program because people are contradictory and, you know, have conflicting emotions and all these manner of things. I think really the question we need to be asking is, if it's likely that AI could be used to manipulate people, why are we not having a larger conversation about what AI could be used for that could benefit people? Because I think it's quite a dystopian future where AI is used to trick us and convince us to spend more money and so on, when we could be using technology for much better things.
All right, interesting. Thanks so much for your thoughts on that.